This lecture is the lecture that's given on Monday, January 25th on cognition in first and fifth period. When we talk about cognition, we're talking about thinking in this case. With thinking, when we break it down, we have 5 distinct units of thoughts. The first is an image, and an image is a visual representation of an idea. So if I said, think of a dog, and you thought of a picture of your own dog or of another dog, then that would be the image. It would be a visual representation of that idea. A symbol is a abstract representation of an idea. What I mean by that is that the image or thing that you see that represents the idea has nothing to do with the idea itself. So when you see a red octagon, we know that that represents a stop sign, but stop signs on their own, or red octagons on their own, have nothing to do with stop signs. Words are another example of this. Squiggly lines have nothing to do with ideas, and yet we've combined those squiggly lines together to make a word which then represents the idea. So in this way, it's abstract because it doesn't directly go with the idea itself. A schema or a concept is a way to categorize many different things that share characteristics. So for example, if you said something like an animal or a mode of transportation, or if you said a type of sport, all of these would be concepts where everything that fits into it has similar characteristics. A prototype is the first thing that comes to mind, kind of our own representation of that concept. So if you said modes of transportation, you'd probably think of something like a car or a bus or a plane or a train, but you probably wouldn't think of something like a hot air balloon. And finally, a rule is a statement that connects multiple concepts together. So if I drove to this grocery store to get orange juice, then driving would be a mode of transportation, grocery store would be a type of business, and orange juice would be a type of beverage. We use these 3 types of thoughts to guide how we think. There are 3 primary types of thinking. Directed thinking is when we have some sort of instruction from someone or something to tell us how to think. This can be someone asking you a question. It could be someone telling you, I want you to think about this. It could also be something like instructions on a page, which guide you on how to think about certain topics. It could even be something as simple as a math formula, where the math formula tells you how to think about the different variables in that formula. Non-directed thinking is when we think when there is no direction given to us, when we just let our mind wander and kind of pop into what we're going to think about on our own. And finally, we have metacognition. And metacognition is thinking about thinking. So if you have to think about how to give instructions to someone, we know instructions are a form of directed thinking. And so that would be thinking about how to give those instructions would be a form of directed thinking. Conversely, if you had something like a physics problem which asked you which formula you might use to solve a problem, formulas are forms of directed thinking. And so thinking about the different types of formula would be thinking about thinking. When we go to solve problems, many times we use convergent thinking. And that's where our mind converges or comes together on a single individual thought. A lot of times, this helps us get the solution to many of our problems. One instant where this happens is a cognitive bias known as functional fixedness. Functional fixedness basically says that we can only think about how to use certain objects for their original intended purpose. And yet, sometimes we don't do that. Sometimes we overcome functional fixedness. And when we do that, we are actually operating under divergent thinking. And divergent thinking is when we let our mind explore many different possibilities. So instead of them converging on one idea together, they are diverging into many different solutions. When we come up with a novel solution or a new solution to a problem that we need to solve, we have creativity. And that moment in which we've developed that novel solution, that creative, novel, new solution, where all of a sudden it just gets into our head and we're like, that's it, I know it. That's our moment of insight. There are 4 distinct problem-solving strategies. Each one allows us to solve many different problems in our life, but each one has a drawback as well. An algorithm is where we exhaust every single individual possibility in order to get the solution. And the great thing about algorithms is that if we do that, we're going to be 100% right. The problem with algorithms is that they take too long. And most of the time, we don't have time to exhaust and look at every individual possibility. Intuition is when we feel that something is right, when we trust our gut and go with our instinct. But as many of us have experienced, a lot of time that's not always the correct solution. Heuristics are when we assume information in some way in order to solve a problem faster. It is essentially a mental shortcut. The issue, and a lot of times our assumptions about information are correct. The problem with heuristics is that sometimes those assumptions can be based on incomplete information, and which could cause false assumptions and incorrect solutions. And then finally, we have a mental set. And a mental set is when we use a previously used strategy to a similar problem. And that works a lot of the times because a lot of times our similar problems are generally the same. The issue is that sometimes they're not. And we may not realize it until after we've exercised that strategy. In talking about heuristics, there are 3 different heuristics that can cause us to create false assumptions based on incomplete information. The representativeness heuristic is when we make an assumption based on our own personal stereotypes about a concept, or when we're looking at people, it's our own personal prototypes and stereotypes. For example, let's say that you had a problem of which person should I trust to give me a home loan, and you had one person who was in a business suit and a briefcase, and another person who was in a leather jacket and leather pants and sunglasses. Now, you might assume that the person in the business suit is the banker and the person in the leather jacket is probably some sort of biker, but we don't know that for sure. And that could cause an incorrect solution to that problem if, for example, your own personal banker may like to wear leather jackets and sunglasses. We may also assume incorrect information if we use the availability heuristic, which is that we make assumptions based on the information that we have available to us. The problem is a lot of time that information is incomplete. So if, for example, many people are scared of flying because they've heard sensationalized news stories about planes crashing, they may be scared to fly and might opt to drive instead. And yet, auto accidents are a huge killer of people across the world. Why would they make that assumption? Well, because they hear about that news story in which planes crash, but they don't hear about all those other news stories where planes didn't crash. And then when we have the anchoring heuristic, and the anchoring heuristic tells us that when we have an established mental position, and we may establish it on our own or someone may establish it for us, we might change our minds from that mental position, but not very far. This often works with numbers, but can also work with ideas. So if I said, how much more or less than 1,500 miles is the coastline of California, you may say something like 1,700 or 1,400 or maybe even 1,800, but the answer is 3,000 miles. And because I've established that mental position by giving you that number of 1,500, you're unwilling to leave that mental anchor very far. Some things that add to our mental anchors, though, is the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias says that when we have an opinion about something or a belief about something, when we hear information that confirms that belief or makes us right, we're more likely to believe it. When we hear people give that information, we're more likely to trust those people. And we're more likely to discount information and people that tell us that our beliefs are wrong, because we don't like to be told that we're wrong, even when they possibly may be right. By doing that, it establishes that mental anchor for the anchoring heuristic even further and deeper and makes us even less willing to leave it when we have that belief that we're right. Ultimately, all 4 of these things lead to what we call belief perseverance. And belief perseverance is when we've established a strong opinion that we are unwilling to leave from, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. And this occurs because of all those things that I just covered. And those things cause us to believe our opinions more than logical evidence. And that is the end of the lecture.